She sat in court and prayed, hoping that some kind of miracle might still come to her. To her relatives and her father, she still looked like a young teenager, someone they could not believe was capable of doing something so serious. The defense attorney argued that it was the result of psychological trauma from the war, an acute mental health episode, and that her actions were only a form of self-defense. At first, the case seemed like nothing more than a family accident. The judge listened and considered the arguments, but when the scene findings and medical reports were presented, everything changed. What you are about to see is the moment Sofia Koval realized that her uncontrolled and reckless actions would change the course of her future. This is a case that began as what appeared to be a family accident and ended in tragedy. And every detail you are about to witness has been verified through court records, testimony presented in court, and the judge's sentencing decision. If you have never heard this story before, prepare yourself, because what happened in Lauderdale Lakes, Broward County, Florida, on the 23rd of May, 2024, will challenge everything you thought you knew about a family that seemed safe on the outside, but carried hidden issues no one could have fully predicted. In Lauderdale Lakes, Florida, a quiet family apartment became the center of a case that would leave one father standing between two losses, the mother who raised him and the daughter he still loved. The victim was Yevheniya Koval, a 79-year-old woman living in Broward County. The accused was her granddaughter, Sofia Koval, only 14 years old at the time. Sofia's father, Vladimir, also identified in some reports as Volodymyr Koval, was Yevheniya's son. The family had roots in Ukraine, and their life in South Florida carried the weight of a difficult migration, separation, and adjustment after war. For an American audience, the most important point is that the public record does not present this as a simple story of a violent stranger or a planned attack from outside the home. It was a domestic case, contained inside a private residence, where the people involved knew each other closely. Yevheniya was not an anonymous victim. She was a mother and grandmother. Sofia was not an adult offender with a long public record. She was a minor, and because of that, the legal process had to move carefully between accountability and juvenile law. Public records and local reporting describe Sofia as a teenager who had recently come from Ukraine to the United States. According to information attributed to her father in the arrest paperwork, she had seen the effects of war, had been separated from her mother, and had struggled with behavioral issues after arriving in America. Her father later told the court that Sofia had difficulty adapting to school and to a new life. He also described concerns about her emotional state, her sleep, and her ability to cope. Those details do not excuse what happened, but they form part of the background that investigators and prosecutors had to consider. Before the night of the incident, life inside the home was already tense. Sofia was still a child, but the problems around her had become serious enough that her father tried to discipline her. On the 22nd of May, 2024, Vladimir took away Sofia's cell phone because of what he described as behavioral problems. It was a small household decision, the kind many parents make, but in this case it became one of the last known points of conflict before the fatal encounter. That evening, Vladimir left the apartment at Pearl Condominiums on Northwest 41st Street in Lauderdale Lakes. According to the reports, he went to visit a friend and was away from about 7 p.m. until about 12:30 a.m. Inside the apartment, Yevheniya remained with Sofia. There was no public record of a camera recording that shows the full sequence of events. There was no publicly released transcript that captures every word spoken inside that home. What is known comes from the arrest report, the medical findings, and what family members and investigators later told authorities. Sometime during the hours when Vladimir was gone, something changed inside the apartment. Sofia later allegedly told her father that her grandmother had scratched her. She claimed she responded in self-defense. According to the arrest report, as summarized by local media, Sofia was accused of striking Yevheniya multiple times with a belt. Other reporting, citing the same investigative materials, stated that investigators also believed a walker used by the elderly woman may have been involved. These details were reported as allegations from the case file, not as a full eyewitness account. Sofia was accused of carrying out the assault. The exact trigger, the order of actions, and the full exchange between grandmother and granddaughter have not been publicly established in a complete minute-by-minute record. What investigators could see, however, was the result. Yevheniya suffered extensive bruising and serious injuries. The encounter inside that apartment was not a brief argument that ended without consequence. It became a fatal event, one that would soon draw police, medical personnel, and prosecutors into the private space of a family already under strain. When Vladimir returned around 12:30 a.m. on May 23, he walked into a scene no son expects to find. His mother was on the floor and unresponsive. Reports described visible marks, including injuries around her neck area and bruising to her face, arms, and legs. Vladimir had left his mother alive with his teenage daughter. He came back to find her unable to respond. The discovery immediately shifted the situation from a family crisis to an emergency. Vladimir called 911. Public reporting identifies him as the person who made the emergency call. What has been reported is the core of the emergency. A woman in the apartment was unresponsive, and her son had found her on the floor with visible injuries after returning home. The call brought first responders to the condominium complex in the early hours of the morning. When authorities arrived, they met Vladimir at the residence. He told them he had been away visiting a friend and had left his mother at home with Sofia. Emergency personnel treated the situation as urgent and transported Yevhenia to Broward Health Medical Center. Despite those efforts, she was pronounced dead at the hospital. For investigators, the questions began immediately. How had an elderly woman suffered such injuries inside a residence where only one other person was known to be present? What had happened during the hours between Vladimir's departure and return? The Broward Sheriff's Office began investigating the death as suspicious. Detectives documented the condition of the scene and the injuries described in the medical findings. Later reporting stated that the autopsy found widespread bruising, head trauma, and internal bleeding. The Broward Medical Examiner's Office determined that Yevhenia's death was a homicide, meaning her death was caused by another person. That legal and medical conclusion turned the case into something more than a tragic household emergency. It became a criminal investigation. The timeline mattered. Detectives had to narrow the window to the hours when Vladimir was away. They had to compare what he reported with the injuries observed by responders and later documented by medical examiners. They also had to determine whether the scene supported an accidental explanation, a medical emergency, or an assault. Once the homicide ruling was made, the focus sharpened. The case was no longer only about finding out why Yevhenia had not survived. It was about identifying who caused the injuries and whether the evidence supported a criminal charge. Detectives focused on the person who had been in the apartment with Yevhenia during the critical window of time. That person was Sofia. She was 14, which made every step more complicated. The case involved a severe allegation, an elderly victim, a teenage suspect, and a father who had lost his mother while facing the possibility that his own daughter was responsible. According to information later reported from the sheriff's office, Sofia was taken for medical clearance on the day of the incident. The next day, Friday, the 24th of May, 2024, she was taken into custody and processed through the Juvenile Assessment Center. At first, the accusation against Sofia was second-degree murder. Because of her age, there was public uncertainty about whether the case would remain in the juvenile system or move toward adult court. Florida law allows certain serious cases involving juveniles to be handled in adult court, but that decision carries major consequences. Prosecutors had to weigh the severity of Yevhenia's injuries, Sofia's age, the family history, the available evidence, and the legal options under state law. Sofia allegedly told her father that Yevhenia had scratched her and that she acted to protect herself. She was also reported to have admitted striking her grandmother multiple times with a belt. Afterward, she allegedly cried and apologized. Some reporting also described a statement in Ukrainian, translated in substance as Sofia, saying that her grandmother was already close to dying and that she had helped her die. Investigators continued building the file. The strongest parts of the case were not dramatic courtroom speeches or a public confession. They were the emergency call, the father's account, the known timeline, Sofia's presence in the apartment, the physical condition of Yevhenia, the medical examiner's conclusion, and the statements attributed to Sofia in the arrest paperwork. Together, those facts gave prosecutors a basis to move forward. By October 2024, the case had taken a clearer legal shape. The Broward State Attorney's Office filed an adult court charge of manslaughter against Sofia on the 1st of October 2024. The office publicly announced the decision the next day, explaining that the case involved the fatal beating of her grandmother on May 23. Prosecutors said they considered the seriousness of the case, the circumstances presented by the defense, and Sofia's age. They chose to charge manslaughter, not to proceed with a higher murder count as the final adult court charge. The adult court filing changed Sofia's status. She was transferred from juvenile custody to the Broward County Jail, where she was held under protective conditions. During an early court appearance, a judge found probable cause and ordered that she be held without bond. For the public, the case was unsettling because it did not fit simple categories. It involved a child accused of a grave act, an elderly grandmother who died from injuries, and a father whose grief ran in two directions at once. On the 30th of October 2024, Sophia appeared in adult court and entered a plea of no contest to manslaughter. A no contest plea is not the same as a traditional guilty plea, but it means the defendant does not challenge the charge for purposes of conviction and sentencing. Under the agreement, Sophia was adjudicated delinquent while carrying an adult criminal record. The sentence, however, followed juvenile sanctions allowed under Florida law. The court ordered Sophia into the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice Maximum Risk Commitment Program, the highest level of juvenile commitment in the state. The commitment could last up to 3 years. After that, she would remain under community supervision until the age of 21. Prosecutors also stated that because Sophia was not a United States citizen, she could later be transferred to federal authorities for possible removal to Ukraine after completing her period of commitment. The plea hearing also reflected the limits of the justice system in a case involving a child defendant. An adult prison sentence was legally possible in the broader structure of adult court, but prosecutors and the court accepted a juvenile disposition. That outcome did not erase the seriousness of the offense. It placed Sophia in the highest level of juvenile commitment available, while still recognizing that she was 14 when the incident occurred. The sentence was therefore both punitive and rehabilitative, at least in its legal design. In court, Vladimir Koval faced the outcome as both the victim's son and the accused girl's father. He had lost Yevgenia, the woman whose life stretched across countries, hardship, family, and survival. He was also watching Sophia, his daughter, be sentenced for the act that ended her grandmother's life. Public reporting described him as supportive of the plea agreement, while still acknowledging the pain of the case. His position showed the central tragedy of the story. This was not only a criminal case, it was a family fracture that no sentence could fully repair. That distinction would later shape how the case was reported, discussed, and remembered by the public. The case of Sofia Koval and Yevgenia Koval remains defined by what is known and what is not. The known facts are stark. A father left home in the evening. An elderly grandmother stayed with her teenage granddaughter. Hours later, the father returned and found his mother unresponsive. Police and medical personnel responded. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. The granddaughter was arrested, charged, and later resolved the case with a no-contest plea to manslaughter. She received a juvenile maximum risk commitment, followed by supervision until adulthood. That boundary is what gives the case its documentary weight. It does not need exaggeration. It is already difficult enough as it stands: a 79-year-old woman gone, a 14-year-old girl in state custody, and a father left to explain the unexplainable in a courtroom. In the end, the legal system named the offense manslaughter. The sentence placed Sophia in the most secure level of juvenile commitment Florida offers. But outside the legal language, the case remains a record of how quickly a troubled home can turn into a permanent loss, and how a single night in Lauderdale Lakes changed one family forever. The largest message from this case is that serious trouble inside a home should never be dismissed as ordinary conflict when it involves a vulnerable elderly person and a struggling minor. Families may try to manage pain privately, especially when immigration, trauma, and financial pressure are involved. But silence can leave everyone more exposed. Sophia's background may explain part of the context, but it does not erase the harm done to Yevgenia. The case shows why early intervention, mental health support, elder safety, and honest communication are not optional. They can be the difference between crisis and irreversible loss. The lesson from this case is not to judge a family from a distance, but to understand how quickly pressure can grow when no one has enough support. Parents and caregivers should take behavioral changes seriously, especially in children who have experienced trauma, displacement, separation, or major life disruption. Elderly relatives also need protection, not because every home is unsafe, but because age and physical vulnerability can make any conflict more dangerous. When warning signs appear, families should seek help from schools, doctors, counselors, community services, or emergency resources before the situation reaches a breaking point. This case also reminds viewers that justice has limits. A sentence can assign responsibility, but it cannot restore a lost life or repair a family completely. Prevention, awareness, and timely help matter long before a courtroom becomes involved.